everyone. I am Jewel Davis, Chair of the North Carolina Library Association's Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns. Welcome to our final webinar in our May Culture Conversation series. Our session for today is on exploring de-authenticity, impact on POC, implications for practice. Before we begin, I would like to highlight that we will have chat, video, and audio available for you to participate today. Please feel free to use the tools available to respond to questions and prompts. If at any time you would like to respond anonymously, please privately chat me and I will respond for you without disclosing your name. So let's get started. I am very excited to introduce our speaker today. Kaetrena Davis Kendrick is currently Associate Librarian and Associate Professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. A graduate of the historic Clark Atlanta University School of Library and Information Studies, Kendrick's research interests include racial and ethnic diversity in the LIS field, professionalism, ethics, and the role of digital humanities in practical academic librarianship. She is the co-editor of The Small and Rural Academic Library, Leveraging Resources and Overcoming Limitations, and author of Kaleidoscopic Concern, an annotated chronological bibliography of diversity, recruitment, retention, and other concerns regarding African American and ethnic library professionals and global evolution, an annotated chronological bibliography of international students and U.S. academic libraries. Welcome, Ms. Kendrick.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone for being here. Just a quick clarification. My name is pronounced Kaetrena, so please call me Kaetrena, or Trina is fine. I'm excited to talk with you guys today about de-authentication in libraries. And so we're going to get started. We have about an hour. I have lots of slides, but I'd be glad if I don't use them because I do see this as a dialogue. I also want to preface before we get started that I perceive this, because this study kind of comes out of my low morale research, which I'll talk about within how this kind of connects in a few moments as well. I do also consider this a safe space. And so people may disclose things today that need to stay in this space, and I would just ask that we be respectful of that. And then also, because authenticity is about being vulnerable, I'd like for you to consider doing so as much as you feel comfortable. And also, if you don't want to share things too, again, if you don't want people to be, your name to be associated with their questions, please do send them to Jewel, and I will get to them quickly. So you have lots of ways to interact with me today. I've kept the chat open. I'm keeping video options open. And then, of course, anytime you can contact me, Jewel will be helping me manage those channels. There are lots more of you than there are of me. I am a twin, but unfortunately she didn't clone in and come in today. So it's just me. So I'll just be relying on Jewel to kind of help me manage all those channels in which you can try to talk with me today. So let's get started. So when we consider authenticity, there are lots of things out there talking about authenticity and vulnerability. A lot of you might be thinking of Brene Brown, Oprah's friend, who talks about vulnerability and does a lot of shame research. But when I looked at it from a sociology standpoint, this is the definition of authenticity from Hepworth and colleagues. It is the sharing of self by relating in a natural, sincere, spontaneous, open, genuine manner. And being authentic or genuine involves relating personally. So expressions and discussions and interactions are spontaneous rather than feeling like contrived, like you're thinking about what you're going to do before you do them, and we'll get into that. And just by the way, another thing too is and anytime you feel like you want to ask something, don't wait until I say any questions. Feel free to put them in. So I know it takes a while to form questions, so you don't have to wait till I say any questions. So that's what I found when I saw this, was looking for this a basic social definition of what does authenticity really mean outside of how it's being kind of shown to us in the popular culture, particularly recently. When we do look at Brene Brown's more popular idea. She talks about authenticity as a daily practice that includes the actions of being emotionally honest, setting boundaries, allowing that vulnerability that I mentioned just a few moments ago, exercising compassion not only to other people, but really unto oneself, and then nurturing connections as well with others and yourself, letting go of how you're supposed to think you're supposed to act or supposed to be according to others. And then also, finally, it's a daily practice of learning to accept oneself. And she has this, when this is coming from her research, when she boiled it down, she does this qualitative research. And after she talked to all these people, these are the common markers of authenticity, and it's happening daily within these individuals. They do it as a thing that they do often, and in terms of as much as they possibly can. They are emotionally honest. They set boundaries. They allow themselves to be open and sharing with other people. They exercise self-compassion and compassion for others. They try to make connections with others. They let go of how they're supposed to be, and then they're working really hard towards being able to accept themselves within those parameters or lack of parameters. So today's conversation, and I really do see it as a conversation, is sparked by my emerging data. So in 2016, I did a study on low morale just generally within the profession. And when I did my call, I didn't hear from any librarians of color. However, that low morale study came out, and we now know that low morale is the um, um, result of repeated and protracted exposure to workplace abuse and negligence. So that's what came out of that study. But I realized that I hadn't heard from librarians of color or ethnic racial minority librarians. So I put out a call for a second study. And so the data that I'll be sharing with you is a small piece of data. It's emerging data. It's actually nascent data. But I heard it enough where I started to think maybe it's another sort of phenomenon. So this is a working discussion for me, and I'm working on it, hopefully with you. So it's sparked by the data in this current study that I'm working with data analysis on. But it's also not necessarily a new thing in the culture, particularly in African American culture. It's supported. This idea of de-authentication is supported by art. It's in our literature and even in ongoing commentary in popular culture. However, for today, I like it to be dialogue focused. So hopefully you've read the blog I did on considering de-authenticity, and we can have a conversation about that, your comments on that too.
So if you go into your personal wallet, whatever.
So here's a quote from a colleague or a person in the study. She said, so I really don't say much about my frustrations at all to them, my colleagues, my non-PoC colleagues. I guess I just accept it. I say I'm just trying to maintain the status quo, and I don't want to add any fuel to any fires, and I don't want to be the one accused of gossiping about the administrator. So I just do it to stay on a safe level, you know. And safe means that I'm not going to get punished for something I say or for critiquing the library administrator. So that's one comment. So right now I'm kind of sharing with you some of the comments that kind of sparked this idea of what's going on here. Another person said, I wrote a massive response to an unfair evaluation, and this response was ignored. You know, short of saying this is racist and you have bias toward me. I stood up in my response, but I made the response as devoid of anger as possible so I wouldn't get canned because I needed to keep my job. I'm hoping you're seeing where these little pockets of de-authenticity are happening. Can anybody tell me in here maybe where the de-authentication may be happening in here? It might be familiar, particularly to women of color. So you can go ahead and add it if you can see where that piece of de-authenticity might be going on in this statement here. And another person, this is a male, he said, now the irony was that my supervisor was very proud that I was going and doing another program. This person had decided that they were going to get another degree while they were working at this particular library. So she was very supportive to some extent, but I kept her. I really didn't involve her. I kept information to a minimum so that she, again, would not use that against me. So anyone here, if you're thinking about how this person might be de-authenticating here in order to move along or get along or do their job with as little friction as possible. And remember, this is all going on within this larger context of low morale. So this is an added situation going on in addition to the low morale experience that they're having. So I want you to keep that in mind, that this stuff is happening while I'm asked, this stuff is being revealed to me within the context of a low morale experience, which is the larger landscape that is going on when they're telling me these things. It says, muting her message to remove the anger, right? And the de-authentication in my mind is, I can't have an emotion. I can't show anger. I can't show emotion here. And for the Hispanic male saying, I'm not telling this person what I'm doing. I'm not sharing this thing, even though it's actually helping my career, I'm choosing not to say it. I'm choosing not to share details here about something that's very good that's going on in my life, that's actually going to be good for the library even too. And another African-American female, this is kind of she was kind of recognizing this other issue of de-authentication, which is the perception. So she said, she was talking about someone else, another African-American person in the library, and her perception of how they were dealing with things as opposed to how she was dealing with things. So she says, so if you're like what we refer to as skinning and grinning, then you're acceptable. But if you're going about your job, doing what you need to do, you know, there's a problem. Right, self-policing and stereotype replacement. So this idea of skinning and grinning is this other aspect of stereotyping, right? So if you're acting like a stereotype, which maybe our colleagues might perceive as the real us, if they don't know a lot about culture or have culturally incompetent, say, they might feel more comfortable with that. And we have those conversations on the ground often. So there's this other side of recognizing intraracially with another African-American that there's another sort of performance going on. But that's also a form of de-authentication too, so because you're performing. So performing is de-authentication too. So I want to share these data with you, these qualitative data. By the way, this is a qualitative, completely qualitative study. I talked to over 20 librarians over a number of hours, and so this is, and I'm using the resultant data from these librarians that we talked to, pure qualitative research. So there were also some ideas of the absence of, so Brene Brown and other researchers talk about the inverse of what happens when you're not authentic. And the inverse or the impact of that inauthenticity is usually some aspect of shame or embarrassment. And one person talked about that specifically. I feel shame because I feel like I'm betraying myself, betraying my family, betraying so much of, you know, and again, it's so silly because it's just work. So if you're thinking about that idea of vocational off, you've been reading resilience narratives also connected with low morale and things like that. Fobazi Attar talks about this idea of vocational off. So this idea when this person is saying it's just work. But it is a huge part of my life, you know, so when I feel like I can't be who I really am because other people are looking down on me for who I really am. So this person, I asked her specifically, how much of yourself do you think you leave behind when you walk in the door? And she said about 80%. And she talked about things like when she talks to her colleagues, she does specific things like reduces her accent, or she specifically makes sure that she enunciates every word to lower any instance where she might pronounce a word with her mother tongue accent or something like that. Yes. So if you haven't read Fobazi Attar's article on vocational awe, consider how, if you're going through this phenomenon, how that plays into or ties into why you may be going through this phenomenon, and how, because we do identity and professional identity as well as cultural identity kind of clash here in this de-authentication phenomenon, I think. Are there any questions? I can stop here just for a moment to see if there are any questions. I'll pause. So I wanted to know if any of these quotes resonate with you, and if so, in what ways? And if they don't, why? Maybe why? What are you considering? Like I said, this is a working idea that I've been looking at as I go through the data. But do these quotes resonate with you? Have you felt any aspect of these angles of what I would consider, or what I'm calling, de-authentication? Jules says, I feel like I can't be my full self when I'm at work. So, Jewel, if you care to elaborate a little bit, what sorts of things might you not be as full about? It says, absolutely, it can be exhausting to have to hide who you are. Yeah. That is some labor. And I do believe that it's a sort of labor that happens because you're constantly worrying about the other, not only being the other, but being perceived by others. It's very hard. There's an expectation to assimilate to the culture of the workplace. When you say workplace, do you mean libraries in general, or academia at large, or both, or something else? Emotional maturity. I missed. I suppose I feel it. This is interesting. I suppose I feel it by not bothering to engage at all. Well, you know, this is that part and parcel of this low morale experience. So if you've read the study or followed it in any capacity, one of the outputs of low morale is this disengagement with your colleagues. But and I remember what I said, this is when the context, within the context. So now you're suffering from low morale and double down. So just to be clear, one of the questions I have is, for my study is, is there a double down on the low morale for people of color, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, and librarianship? I was trying to figure out if there was a double down, and if there is, what is the double down? And I think this is part of that double downing. Like, you know, I'm going through low morale, and also all these other things are happening. Okay. Let's see. I'm gonna scroll back down and get to some other things. But I think I don't think this is off topic. Whatever way you're feeling your de-authentication is how you're feeling your whatever part you have to hide in order to, you know, you consider reducing friction. You can't be your full self. So I don't think it's necessarily off topic. Is that much? They had a full personality change. That's a lot of de-authentication going on. Microaggressions in general and tokenism in many libraries. Yeah. So we're going to talk about that in a few moments, about libraries in general and the culture of libraries and librarianship too. So I thank you everyone for responding. I appreciate that. Keep responding. These questions are kind of iterative and they build upon each other. So if you have answers or more things you'd like to say, please continue to participate. And just FYI, I'm going to ask that this particular transcript, if you not necessarily be shared. So feel free, if you, as much as you choose to engage. So as I said earlier, while I'm looking at the study, I don't think that our naming this phenomenon or framework or however it's going to pop out, it's not necessarily a new idea, right? So Paul Laurence Dunbar said it a long time ago in his poem, We Wear the Mask. So if you're familiar with the poem, We Wear the Mask that grins and lies, covers our faces, shades our eyes. So read that poem and you'll see this is not a new phenomenon. Even if you read W.B. Du Bois, The Soul of Black Folks, when he talks about double consciousness, this is not new, a new idea or a new development in the psychology of people of color by any means. I'm just exploring it a little bit more in terms of African American or people of color in librarianship. Really is, how is it manifesting when people are dealing with these other things going on? What I also consider that is not new in the literature, there's books about stereotype threat, presumed incompetent, Jane Alabi's information about a study on microaggressions, where these kind of commentary, sort of commentary about de-authentication comes up. And I also believe that people de-authenticate so they can avoid microaggressions. So if you feel that you've done that in order to avoid someone, quote unquote, coming at you or saying something out of line, wherein then you'll be dealing with an additional labor of explaining or leading or guiding, being a teacher, being the representative of the culture bearer. Maybe that's why you also de-authenticate. That's one of the theories I have on why this phenomenon occurs. And then also this idea of stereotype threat, which is basically, I feel like I have to prove myself and be the representative for my group to show that I am competent. But that also indicates another sort of labor that happens. And then there's also the presumed incompetent, particularly for women, which is an added gender disparity and something to another barrier that occurs. And when I was crafting my blog post talking about this de-authentication idea, BuzzFeed published this piece about how women and African-American women have to conform to get jobs. So they talk about what it's like to enter the workforce, but they specifically discuss how they have to assimilate generally to Eurocentric dress and hair norms, speaking norms, um, uh, um, and body modification, or even sometimes body modification norms. So again, not new, because particularly in corporate America, you have to, in order to get this job, you have this dress policy that you have to work in, or this speaking policy, whatever, speaking norms and things like that, you have to centralize in order to, quote unquote, be successful. So I'm saying this recognizing full well that this is not new. However, I'm just kind of, again, seeing what's going on in our field in the industry of academic librarianship. So my long working definition for de-authentication is that it is a cognitive process that people of color traverse to prepare for or navigate predominantly white workplace environments, resulting in decisions that hide or reduce aspects of the influence of their ethnic, racial, or cultural identity, and the presentation of their natural personality, language, physical and mental self-images and representations, interests, relationships, values, traditions, and more, to avoid macro or microaggressions, shaming, incivility, punishment, or retaliation, and which results in barriers to sharing their whole selves with their colleagues and clients. So that's a long definition, but I was trying to get everything in there. I don't know if I can make it more concise. I'll work on it. But that's my working definition for de-authentication. That kind of encompasses what I was seeing in the data. But also, let's be honest, you can see me. I have several markers that indicate that I've probably gone through this process myself. So I was also looking at my own experiences, but mostly this comes from the data that I was gaining, the emerging data that I was receiving from the folks in the study. So when you see this definition, I'd like to know what you think about it. Really quickly, what do you think about this definition? It's long. I'll go back to it. It's long, but I like to know what you think. And then also I like you to know that this is positive with what I call, or juxtaposed with what I call the privilege of authenticity, wherein people in the dominant culture seem to be able to do all these things, dress whatever kind of way they want to. I'm being a little bit informal here, but they can seem to be able to dress how they want to, wear their hair any way they want to. In our profession, you can come in, wear your hair any way you want to, have tattoos on your body markings, all these things, but it doesn't affect them in the same way. So they have the privilege of authenticity. They can talk about their work lives and all sorts of things and not necessarily get dinged for it. For instance, I will think twice before cursing on social media, but perhaps somebody in the dominant culture in my field does that often and doesn't seem to have any repercussions for that. They're not going to be called unprofessional. They might be called a loose cannon or quirky if they have, blood red hair. But if I came in with blood red hair, perhaps I'd be not seen as professional. So I have to kind of consider that kind of double standard. So on the ground, you know, in short terms, it would be called a double standard, but I call it the privilege of authenticity. So I'd like to hear what you think. Ooh, okay, so I'm gonna try to go through these. There's something about avoidance is a techniques. Wait, something about avoidance is a technique. But yes, so even if you do it, someone will come up to you and say something, you know, like you could be sitting at your desk and then someone will come and say, well, Trina knows about this thing. And you're like, no, I don't. You know, what? Oh, I thought you might know about Beyonce. Well, actually, I don't really like Beyonce. I like something else or something like that. So, you know, you kind of be the culture bearer. You could be chilling and someone can just say something. Yeah. And by chilling, I mean working, but you're in your desk or whatever. You don't get a pass at being yourself. You have to be buttoned up and tight and always be professional. You can never let up on yourself, right? But that also goes back to stereotype threat. I have to prove that I'm just as good as or better than, so they don't think that all the people that maybe look like me are like, you know, less than. Yeah. 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 Talking with the group here, there's truth in that. Yeah. It seems pretty comprehensive. I wonder what other communities feel the need to identify. Code switching. Yeah. Always watching what you say. So you're saying always, when you say code switching, do you mean always staying in the dominant code and not being able to code switch? Okay, thank you. Yeah, you always have to stay, you can never even talk how you want to talk, which is difficult sometimes. You can't, because then you'll be forced to be the culture bearer, right? I appreciate that. Okay. And how do you think that impacts how you work with your colleagues, though? How does that work with your colleagues? I think it is, and the reason I named it as a cognitive process is because it was a cognitive process for these folks. They were intentionally not saying things. Like when that person said, I had to go back and rewrite my statement in order to be devoid of anger. When she wrote the original item, it was very angry, she said. And then she showed it to family members, and her family members was like, you can't submit this. And, you know, then she was like, you're right, I can't. So it was an intentional process that she went through. And then like with the Hispanic male, he said, I intentionally do not stay what I am doing. And then the Latina woman was saying, oh, I have to think, she has to think about how she's going to say, how she's going to literally speak. How am I going to pronounce each word as it is coming out of my mouth so no one hears I perceive her mother tongue is Spanish. No one can perceive my Spanish accent, my accent of my mother tongue. Mm-hmm. They're making a decision, and that decision leads to, and people were saying, I'm regretful of that. I wish I could just have said what I needed to say. If I could just say what I need to say in the way that I need to say it, it sure would go easier for me, and probably for the other person too, because they'll understand me. You know, it'd be a lot more clear actually in a certain sort of way. It's rough here because my white colleagues have been able to be themselves, to have rather nasty personalities. It's an all-white environment. I can only protect myself in that mess by leaving them alone. Reacting to them reflects on me. So that stereotype threat. If I am angry, then the white people will think that every Asian or whomever or African American or Hispanic female is like me. And so I have to bear the culture for all the people who look like me. That's harsh. That's hard. Another thing too that I want to mention here in terms of de-authentication is this idea that Shin Freeman has, that in her study about collegiality. So collegiality kind of plays a role in this too. I want you guys to be kind of thinking about the idea of collegiality and what that means for us as academic librarians, as we work with people in the dominant culture. What does that mean? And so one of the things Shin Freeman talks about in her study on collegiality is that academic librarians tend to conflate congeniality with collegiality. So if I like you, that means you're professional, but if I don't like you, that means you're not professional. So I'll leave that on the floor for you to kind of consider too through this process. And let me know what you think about that in terms of the authentication. Because if we want people to like us, we want to be liked so we can get our work done and get through tenure. Because if somebody doesn't like us, they may not vote the way we need them to, even though our work is professional. But if someone doesn't like us and they're going on things that don't necessarily have anything to do with us, that might be dangerous for people of color. And they go through de-authentication, perhaps, to avoid that. So going from there, I just mentioned this idea, how do LIS values enable de-authentication? Can you think of other values outside of this one that I just mentioned about this collegiality idea? This idea that collegiality means I like you in academic librarianship, right? Are there any other values that you can think of that we as librarians believe about ourselves or promote in our professional culture that promote and enable de-authentication for people of color? And this goes back to the vocational awe too, because part and parcel of vocational awe is we have these values that we promote, but they actually kind of choke us out. They cause us to overwork. They cause us to be underpaid. They cause us to have an identity that is not healthy outside in our personal lives at large. The idea of being articulate to be able to help patrons, where articulate is defined by Eurocentric conversational norms. Yes, how we interact with that. We have to interact with our patrons only a certain type of way. And if we're not doing it that way, then we're not good librarians, right? Although I've been a librarianship for like blah years and I still don't know. I've been kind of pondering what actually makes a librarian a good librarian, because the code of ethics is not very specific and people don't know necessarily what librarians do anyway. So when someone says someone is a good librarian, I'm always kind of, well, what does that mean for you? I don't think there's a common, usually one of the parts is it means somebody likes you. Yeah. Information systems that we use erase underrepresented heritage. So this hegemony of these finding systems that we have and discovery systems, yes. We say we value scholarship, but one of the things that comes out that I also talk about in my blog is this idea of the diversity discount. So like a lot of librarians in this study have talked about this idea of diversity rhetoric, and within that they believe that, or have observed that when they do their work on diversity, is not seen as valid as other things, or things that if they do work focusing on their, even if it's the information needs of their particular identity, is still not seen as valid as, say, if you're looking at the information needs of a dominant culture, of the dominant culture. Yes. Yeah. LIS valuing neutrality. Whoever said that idea about valuing neutrality, let's kind of talk about that one a little bit, because if we're neutral, what does that mean? If LIS is neutral, what does that mean for people of color who are de-authenticating? If librarianship is going to be neutral, how does that de-authenticate people of color? While you're thinking about that, I'll keep going. Scholars of color are rarely cited. We're expected to be the diversity librarian. So this idea of this diversity labor, like diversity is the diversity scholarship is discounted, but they want you to do the labor to promote the diversity values on campus. Okay. Neutral is defined by the dominant culture. Neutrality doesn't recognize what people of color are facing every day in the profession. If there's neutrality, then there's an assumed default. Yes. Believe that all PoC are social justice warriors. Lack of discussion about white supremacy and privilege in LIS programs. Well, one of the things that happened in a recent online forum was people were talking about some social justice issue, and a person popped in and says, librarians are for everyone. And I was pleased to see that people were quickly saying, no, they're not. They're not for everybody. Please read your history. And I was like, so slowly this idea reminding people that libraries spouted these values, but we only, only, we only were just let in the first ALA conference like 40 years ago. So so that's a very close time, and that's not even a lifetime ago. So thank you guys. I appreciate that. And another thing about this idea of the overwork, so these ideas, the basic idea, the fundamental idea of vocational awe also plays into it. So the idea that you're going to do more than everybody else, that kind of feeds into the stereotype threat, because see, librarians generally are always going to try to do more with less anyway. But now you're double downing because you're doing more with less, and you're doing the double labor or triple labor, depending on how many things you got coming at you, of dealing with stereotype threat. And then also what I have kind of been thinking about this idea that people of color also experience oppressed group behavior, which is a nice way of stating, that's the formal term for eating their young. So this didn't pop up in the original study for low morale, but it's kind of popping up very subtly in the data for people of color. This idea that people watch at the sidelines and don't offer help. So some people might see it as collegiality, but I see that as when somebody who has more experience than you is watching you and not helping you and seeing what you're going to do and how you're going to react, that's eating your young. So people of color kind of also are kind of talking about this very subtly. I don't think it'll be a major theme, but it didn't show up at all in the first study, but there are pockets of it too for this second study. So just put that out there too, these values that we subscribe to. And when someone mentions about assimilating, well, if we're trying to assimilate, that means we are enabling our own de-authentication, not only as librarians, but also as people who come from non-dominant cultures in the United States or wherever we are practicing. I like to know from here out, we got about 20 minutes left, and I want to give you some time to digest and ask your questions too. What I'd like to know here, if you have de-authenticated at work, how does it affect your library practice? Even if your de-authentication method is complete avoidance, how does it affect your library practice, or if it has affected your library practice? I'd like to hear. Or if you're not going through this process, how do you perceive that it might affect someone else's library practice? Because we work with people every day. And if we can't be, I'm not saying that, tell everybody your business, so to speak, but there should be some sort of vulnerability when we're working with people who are trying to find information. So I wanted to know that. It adds time to whatever you do because you have to rethink things. Yeah. From the time you get up in the morning, if you're really concerned, how am I going to wear my hair today? It took me a long time to decide to go natural in librarianship. And it took me even longer to decide to cut my hair. Because I was like, well, if I want to do things that I want to do, would that harm me in some sort of way? It makes you second guess for yourself. Yeah. So lower professional confidence. Am I really able to do the things that I put on this here CV? Constantly revise things to make sure it's socially acceptable. That, yeah, I look at spell check all the time because I don't want people telling me, oh, well, see, she misspelled a word, so therefore she can't spell, and so all the people that look like her probably can't spell. Waiting until tenure to change or share yourself. They don't get the benefit of what I know and can do. Yes. Imposter syndrome times 10. So you even feel like maybe you're not supposed to be here. I really don't have the skill set. Somebody's going to find out any moment now that I'm not a real librarian. More time and energy. Lack of genuine teamwork is because you don't trust your colleagues, which is a big issue and low morale just in general. That is the abiding factor in low morale from the beginning of an experience and even after experience ends. It's the lack of trust you have in your colleagues. That lack of trust actually gets cultivated the longer you stay in that experience. If I can't be my true self, do I really belong? Now we're talking about a recruitment, advancement, and retention issue. And that is the clincher. Everybody see my hands? Let me clench. Wait, clench. That is the clincher. We say, so one of the values that I wanted to mention, I'm gonna go back to this value. Librarians say, we say that a value of ours is racial and ethnic diversity. We say that a value of ours is racial and ethnic diversity. I'm gonna pretend like I'm in a large room to get it to the people in the back. We say that one of our values is retention and recruitment and racial and ethnic diversity. That's what we say. However, ALA Diversity Counts tells us that that is not a value that we are really considering seriously. Now, we are really interested in recruitment. Interested. Are we interested in advancement and retention? I'll leave that to the floor. So that's how we talk about, we say we want this diversity, but we have this phenomenon going on where we can't even be ourselves. So we want racial and ethnic diversity to what end, at what cost? We want everybody to look a certain way, but everybody acts, we want everybody to look, we want people to kind of look different maybe, but act the same. Is that what I'm hearing from this group? I'm here, but they want me to act like something else. So do they really want diversity in my field? Do I really belong? Okay. Taking on too much work to seem like a team player, like I belong. Vocational and also stereotype threat. 2, if I take on this work, then see, I'm just as good as you guys. I'll do it. I don't want to be seen as lazy, so I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. Absolutely not. They want statistical numbers, not what I really have to offer. So when you proceed, now we're talking about tokenism. Which is a whole nother thing, but also part and parcel of de-authenticating. Like you're saying, I don't want to be seen as a token, so I'm just gonna do what I can to avoid that. But the thing of de-authentication is if you de-authenticate, then they might say, oh, well, she's like one of us, let's use her even. It's just a double-edged sword. Does anybody ever get that feeling, well, if I act like this, then maybe they won't come for me, but then they feel comfortable asking for you to do the things, and now you're out in front anyway as the person, right? So this de-authentication thing is sort of a double-edged sword, I think. Thank you all. My other question and something that I'm kind of considering too a little bit more is, and what I would like to know as well is, if you have de-authenticated at work, how does it affect your health? All types of health, mental health, emotional health, they're two different things. Physical health, how does it affect you? Has it affected you? Or how long do you think you're gonna be in good health if you keep de-authenticating? When the standard of success looks like the white librarian with that culture speech looks, hiring folks you think will be successful will continue to hire more of the same. Yes. So if you haven't read this article, We Are for Diversity, but ... take a look at that. And they offer recommendations, and it was written by 2 Caucasian women, but it's called We're All for Diversity ... and it talks about hiring practices of academic communities and how they enable white supremacy, white centering, and how they cannot do that, continue to do that if they so choose to. Says it takes time away from her personal time because she has to transition from oneself to another. So this is the mental work of the double consciousness, Mm-hmm. Any trauma, there are unseen and long-term or rapid, long-lasting repercussions. Ooh, okay. Back, neck pain, depression, lack of self-worth, high blood pressure, weight gain, poor sleep, starting to recognize prolonged stress in the body. And we know that some of these conditions, particularly hypertension, we don't need any help. People of color don't need any help, any social or workplace help in developing these conditions, because some of them are just genetic within our genetic code. All right, y'all can continue. Thank you so much. So I'd like to share with you, so when I did this blog post about considering de-authenticity, I asked people if they so choose to take a little survey. So I'd like to share, this is my first time sharing these responses with anyone. So I'd like to share them with you all today. So 28% of the respondent group was African American, 25% was multiracial, 21% was Asian, and 19% is Caucasian, keeping in mind that you can be over one race but a ethnic minority. 83% are women. 75% believe they have engaged in the de-authentication as I have defined it so far. 70% have reduced or avoided discussions about religion, politics, or social viewpoints. Remember, the privilege, the de-authentication happens within the context of the privilege of authenticity, okay? Or juxtaposed with it. 66% also reduced conversations about family and personal relationships, and they avoided conversations about cultural or ethnic traditions, formal or informal, okay? 60% have reduced or avoided conversations about non-work related activities, hobbies, or interests. So let's just take away the idea that maybe it's not polite to talk about religion and politics, okay? And maybe you just don't want to tell everybody your business, like what's going on at the home. And also, maybe you just don't want to be the person who has to explain what's going on during Diwali, or, you know, I don't want to be the one that have to tell you that kimchi is delicious and why it's so delicious. I don't want to be the one. I just know it's delicious for me, and I'm not going to tell you why it's delicious. And I'm not going to convince you that it is either. That's not what I'm here to do. But what about this, just not even talking about non-work related? I went to a such and so concert. I went to the park around the corner today. Did you know it was nice? Oh, I went, you know, and flew my kite, such and thus and so. So they're not even having those types of just what we would consider innocuous conversations. And I'll presume from my own experience that maybe it's because, oh, I didn't know you can fly a kite. It's okay, you know. So there's that. 50% have changed or reconsidered their clothing presentation. So you're getting up in the morning and you're already having a conversation about what you're gonna wear. And then 54% have changed or reconsidered creating or sharing content on their social media accounts. Because you don't want someone coming, oh, I saw what you said, blah, blah, blah. And then 46%, just under the half, and I kind of stopped here, have changed or reconsidered body movements or nonverbal behavior. So now we're literally changing and adjusting how we move in space and time in order to make others comfortable. How de-authentication impacts practice. So these are a couple of the things they said, and I'm not giving these demographics. I'm just sharing the quotes at this point. I feel like it's just made me more sad. Even when I try not to be, if I voice any interest in anything, I'm received as aggressive, angry, or self-serving. I have to neutralize my personality so I be considered capable to lead projects and for advancement. The most obvious way is that I feel like I have to be better, a better employee, a better colleague, better customer service representative of my institution to patrons, this last one especially, to demonstrate that I'm not actually better, but just as good of a librarian as my colleagues. While I strive to do my best in any environment, the feeling that I need to work extra hard to be considered good enough and to not have my mistakes be critiqued more harshly than similar mistakes made by white colleagues is exhausting. So this is some vocational, some stereotype threat too. A lot of stereotype threats. So the driving force in this particular instance right here is stereotype threat. It has made my experience as a librarian an experience of the other. I never feel part of the library, nor part of the decisions, nor do I get respect on my achievements. So this goes back to what Jules said about not necessarily ever feeling like you're part of the profession. I do love my job, and I like to think I do it quite well. I work as a systems librarian. However, the authenticating myself means that I curate everything about me, the way I talk, definitely this, the volume of my speech, my dress, my lunch, especially this, which has gotten numerous complaints over time, how I approach people, everything. I work very hard to be the perfect image of a quiet, kind, and knowledgeable librarian. It is hard enough sometimes being a female in systems IT in the librarianship. I lost count of how many times men have been shocked to know I know a thing or two about technology. So I carefully de-authenticate what I can of myself to fit in. And with librarianship being predominantly white, I feel the need to try to fit in. It's why I go through such careful curation of myself to be the person that I feel a librarian is expected to be. That is a mouthful, but it is, there it is. This is has everything in it, which is kind of why I'm sharing it with you. The values problem that we have, the hegemony problem that we have, the racial ethnic diversity problem that we have, the collegiality problem that we have, the gender disparity problem that we have. It's all kind of in here in the statement. I've hidden my Asian heritage and my political beliefs and tried to conform to the white standards so it doesn't look like I am rocking the status quo. So this other value that we have about librarianship is that we're innovative and forward moving, but really we're just about keeping it as it is. So I want you to consider that de-authentication doesn't mean that you just tell all your business. I'm not promoting the idea that we walk in and tell everybody what's going on in our households all the time, or what's going on in our personal lives, in our bedrooms, in our kitchens, on our places of recreation, or in our churches, or whatever other places or spaces that are important to you in your daily life or central to your identity. So that's not something I'm promoting here. What I am promoting and hoping for is that we have a sense of being able to connect with our colleagues and show that we are whole people that have that with a kaleidoscopic experience, and we do not come from monolithic cultures. And the only way that can happen is if we are working hard to kind of de-authenticate. I recognize that it's hard, and there are barriers to that. But this is a phenomenon that I think is important for us to consider and look at, because we're information professionals, and I find it very damaging that our profession is one that we are helping other people to find their fuller selves through access to information, yet we are not able to do it ourselves. It's hypocritical, and it's something we need to consider in our service and in our profession. I recommend some readings for you if you haven't read Jana Alabi's Racial Aggressions and Microaggressions, Academic Libraries. Do so. Diversity of rhetoric is a huge, huge part of this, so you might want to read Meds on Being Included. And then, of course, Brene Brown, I thought it was just me, but it isn't, really talks about the methods of shame and how we react to shame, which is usually to be in anger. We tend to abuse others more when we are shame screening. So I think it's helpful to read it. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. So you can recognize how you may be reacting in ways you're not recognizing to shame or to being when you are going through de-authentication, how that might be impacting your relationships and how you can stop it. And then if you haven't read my study, I'm going to plug it here. Please do read it and let me know what you think. And then I'm working on the upcoming study on PoC folks, and that should be coming out, I hope, in the next year or so. We're working on data analysis now. And then if you're not familiar with what stereotype threat is, I encourage you to take a look at the edited volume by Inslet and Schmader. I want to thank you for your time today. I got 3 minutes, but if I don't get to you today, if there's something you want to follow up with me, please contact me. I'm easily findable on the web. I appreciate your time today, and I want to thank Jewel and NCLA Remco for offering these cultural conversations, also the previous 3 that she hosted. I look forward to hearing from you, and my goal is not to get you to agree with me, but I do want to open up a dialogue. I think it's an important topic that we are able to connect with our colleagues and with our patrons, customers, whatever you call them, users, in whatever context you come across them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kaetrena. We
welcome.
really appreciate the time that you have taken to speak with us. And for our participants, thank you all so much for continually showing up for these culture conversations. I see many of you have been here from the beginning, so thank you for coming and participating.